So today I'm bringing you a furniture flip and I'm going to be working on two different pieces. So I picked up these lovely items from my local Salvos the other day, and this one is a gorgeous console, kind of a Queen Anne, quite traditional style. Paid $45 for this, which is pretty good because the timber's in great quality, the shape is quite nice. I'm going to modernize it by changing out this hardware, which you can't really see here unfortunately, but I'll show you that when I have that set up in my studio. And then this tall boy is a lovely little piece that I think will do quite well, painted in a really neutral sort of boho style, exposed sanded top, and new hardware I think would look really good. And it's a great little height. I think this will go really quickly, and I'm hoping, I think I paid about $75 for this one, and I'm hoping to get maybe, I think $370, $400, depending on how it looks at the end and the styling, of course. So they're the two that I'm going to be working on. And the first thing I'm going to do is just set up my studio and get started onto sanding this little piece here. And then that way I can bring that into the apartment and paint this one and then work on that one at the same time too. So let's get into it. I always try to source pieces that are in good shape and have the potential to be loved again. They just need some good TLC. And this lovely classic Queen Anne console and entry table was screaming for such love. To modernise it for today's buyers, I'm going to change out the hardware and go for a dark, almost black chalk paint. I'm excited about exposing this timber and can't wait to see what is hidden underneath. My first step in the furniture flipping process is to always sand and expose the timber tops. I begin with an 80 grit sandpaper using a low setting of about 3. I did think I was only going to just sand the top part of that lip, but when I was finishing on the 240 grit, I realised it wasn't going to do the table any justice. It would have looked a bit cut off and stumpy, not to mention not showing the curve and stunning feature of the timber underneath. I unfortunately forgot to turn the camera on as I was doing this step. Next, I removed the old hardware. I used pliers to pop out the button grip cover and to loosen the screws. I then sanded the drawer fronts with 120 grit. Here I am testing out the new hardware as I was unsure if I would need to drill in a new hole in the centre of the two existing ones. But thankfully it didn't look odd placed on the inside of the two pre-existing holes. I also filled in the existing hardware holes that I didn't need anymore with timber filler. Generally I would recommend using a spatula to apply this smoothly and evenly, but I didn't have one in hand so I just used my finger. With the hardware all good, I could now move on to lightly scuff sanding the legs. I did this just to smooth out any imperfections. Next step, I tape out the edges so my paint doesn't bleed and stain into the raw timber. Now with all the prep work completed on this classic Queen Anne entry and console table, we can start with the fun part, painting. This is truly where the magic begins. To cut costs down, I mixed some leftover black and grey chalk paint to create this almost charcoal colouring. This piece only took about 15 to 20 minutes to paint, and what is great about doing 2 flips in a day, as this first coat dries, I can move on to my next piece. Chalk paint is one of my favourite paints to paint with. I find it applies really well to the furniture, there's less prep involved, and if you're a newbie getting into furniture painting and flipping, I definitely recommend chalk paint as the first option to try. And this brings us to flip number 2. The style of this tall boy and dresser are a dime a dozen in Sydney, which is great for me because I will never run out of pieces to flip. But what this piece needs is a fresh colouring and hardware combination that will transform it into a more modern item for today's home. The functionality and size is great, but it certainly feels outdated. I'm repeating the exact same process as flip 1 and sanding down this pine timber top. Whilst I'm sanding down this piece, I can also now sand out the dry timber putty on the drawer fronts of flip number 1. Here I'm just setting up my drop cloth to protect my vinyl flooring. And I'm using some leftover blocks just to raise up the dresser so it's easier for me to paint along the bottom sides as well. I unfortunately forgot to record the process of me whitewashing the timber top on this tall boy, but if you check out my past videos, of which I'll link below, you can watch this process. With the piece now all cleaned up and dry, I can now get to painting. I chose a warm off-white cream colouring, as I really wanted to appeal to a broader market for this particular flip. By choosing a neutral colour, this piece could either work for a boho or coastal home. Because the coverage of this paint was so good, I only needed 2 coats. But whilst this first coat was drying, I moved back into the apartment and finished the protection process of the first flip. I love when I get to this process. There's nothing more satisfying than pulling that tape and seeing how clean and crisp the edges are and the paint hasn't bled through. I love using hemp oil to condition and enrichen the timber, and you can see just how much it soaks into the wood. It revitalizes and just makes that timber really shine. After this step, I then wax the body of this table to give a greater depth and richness to the paint. So before we get into the full reveal of both these flips, just want to explain a little bit of the process about a one-day flip. So I like to be able to try and paint as many pieces together at the same time. I find it's a really efficient way of maximizing my time and day, and because time is money, you want to find pieces that you can actually work on simultaneously. So in this case here, I was pretty much flipping between the outside studio space and inside the apartment, between the different coats, and as I was sanding the timber as well. Due to the size of my apartment, I need to be really selective on the style and the size of the pieces I find. So when I'm sourcing and flipping pieces, I want to make sure that I've got clean lines, it's nothing too difficult. I definitely avoid things that require too much maintenance and repair. And there's different techniques that you can use when you're shopping and looking online for these things. And I'll definitely bring a video about all of those things to look for. So definitely stay tuned for that and subscribe if you haven't already to be notified when that video comes out. But today's process is all about trying to just be efficient and maximizing your day. And you can see because these pieces were actually quite similar. One was just straight lines and really solid, and the other one was the console, which has barely any surface to paint. These are actually really fast. So now let's see the full reveal of my one day 2 flips. So if we were to look at the costings on this one day 2 flip, for flip number 1, the costings were $45 for the table originally, and in materials it was about $30 as the hardware was new, but it didn't really cost much for the sanding and the paint supply. And so that total was $75, and this took me about 3 hours. I ended up selling this piece a week later for $250, so this gave me a profit of $175, and if you worked it out, my hourly was $58 from this. And now we get to flip number 2. The costings on this piece were a little bit more. The dresser was originally $75 and the materials I spent were $99, and this was mostly due to the hardware that I chose. In total, the costings were $174 for this flip. I also sold it a week later for $350, giving me a profit of $176. And this piece took about 4 hours to do all up, so that gave me an hourly of $44. Let's go through the overall costings and sales on this one day 2 flip. All up, the sales were $600 combined, giving me a profit of $351 for the 2, And as I only did this for about 4 hours, I ended up getting about an hourly of $88. So a pretty lucrative day. You can see that the costings were quite different between the two, though the profit margins ended up being about the same. So although flipping is about trying to make as much as you can, I find that for me it's become about the art and the creative process and journey of transforming a really old and outdated, very unloved piece into something really modern and new. I do really want these pieces to be enjoyed and functional for the modern homes of today. So if I have to spend and invest a little bit more in the costings, I am quite happy to do that. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and I'd love to see you for the next video. It's going to be a bit of a different style video. It's going to be a vlog, and I'm going to take you behind the scenes of a day in the life of a furniture refinisher and flipper. So if you haven't, subscribe already to get notified for that video. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.